The call came through at 2:17 a.m. Canberra time, Thursday morning, while Australia slept. A secure briefing from Washington to the Department of Defense, not routine intelligence, an operational timeline, 72 hours. That's the window being discussed in classified Pentagon briefings right now. Not for diplomacy, for kinetic action against Iranian nuclear facilities. And here's what nobody's telling you. The Australian Treasury ran stress models on Tuesday. 3 scenarios, all involving the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The Reserve Bank governors were briefed within 6 hours. When central bankers start running war game economics at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, they are not planning for hypotheticals. They are planning for probabilities. What happens to Australia's economy when 21 million barrels of oil per day stop flowing through a 33-kilometre-wide stretch of water? Let me show you what's actually happening. The Australian Financial Review reported this morning, citing 3 defence officials, that Canberra received formal notification Wednesday, not about if Trump authorises strikes, but about when. And Australia's role. Pine Gap, the joint US-Australian intelligence facility in the Northern Territory. According to the ABC's defence correspondent, satellite targeting data for precision strikes on Iranian sites is already being processed through Pine Gap. It started Monday. Australia isn't a bystander. We are operationally involved before the first missile launches. The Reserve Bank's response tells you how serious this is. Governor Michelle Bullock held an unscheduled video conference yesterday with Treasury Secretary Stephen Kennedy and Energy Minister Chris Bowen. 97 minutes. No press release. Bloomberg Australia confirmed it through 3 independent sources. What were they discussing? The Australian Bureau of Statistics shows we hold 54 days of refined petroleum reserves. The International Energy Agency minimum is 90 days. We are already 40% below safety threshold before any conflict begins. Most Australians believe we are energy independent. We produce oil and gas. We are exporters. True, but incomplete. Australia produces light sweet crude. Our refineries were designed for heavy sour, the type from the Middle East. We closed most refineries over the past decade. Kwinana, Geelong, Clyde, all decommissioned. Today, 91% of our refined petroleum products are imported. Singapore's refineries, South Korea's, Japan's. Every facility depends on crude oil flowing freely through the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels per day pass through that strait. That's 21% of global oil supply moving through a narrower than Sydney to Wollongong. Iran stated publicly 3 days ago, Revolutionary Guard commander, that if attacked, the strait closes immediately. Not a threat, declared operational doctrine. The futures market is already pricing this in. Brent crude moved from $84 to $86 per barrel in 5 trading days. That's an 11% increase before anything has happened. This is where most people get it wrong. They think Australia produces energy, so we're fine. That's not how integrated supply chains work. Australia's economy isn't about our energy, it's about Asia's energy, because 68% of our export revenue comes from commodities sold to 3 countries, China, Japan and South Korea. Iron ore, $121 billion annually. Coal, $73 billion. LNG, $91 billion. Those 3 represent 61% of total goods exports, according to the Department of Foreign Affairs' December figures. Every buyer country runs on Middle Eastern oil. China imports 11 million barrels daily, 44% through Hormuz. Japan imports 2.8 million daily, 88% through Hormuz. South Korea, 2.7 million daily, 71% through Hormuz. When their energy costs spike, industrial production contracts. When steel mills in China reduce output because energy is too expensive, they don't need Australian iron ore. When Japanese manufacturing slows, they don't need Australian coal. The demand curve for Australian commodities doesn't soften, it collapses. Iron ore prices fell 8% in a single session during the last Iran strike threat in January 2020. That was just rhetoric. We are now at operational positioning. Fortescue Metals dropped 6.3% in 3 trading days. BHP dropped 4.7%. Rio Tinto dropped 5.2%. The market is already pricing demand destruction. But here's the structural trap. The Reserve Bank is managing inflation at 3.8%, above their 2 to 3% target. They've held rates at 4.35% for 6 consecutive meetings. The inflation is sticky. An oil shock adds immediate imported inflation. Transportation costs spike. Everything transported becomes more expensive. Every $10 increase in crude oil per barrel adds approximately 0.07 cents per litre at Australian pumps within 3 weeks. If oil goes from $84 to $120, well within range during Hormuz closure, that's 25 cents per litre. Petrol prices would hit $2.45 to $2.60 in Sydney and Melbourne. But the RBA can't respond normally. While oil creates inflation, commodity demand collapse creates recession, rising prices and falling employment simultaneously. Stagflation, the worst scenario for central banks. You can't solve both with one interest rate. Raise rates to fight inflation, you accelerate recession. Lower rates to support growth, you embed inflation permanently. The Reserve Bank has no good options, only bad ones and worse ones. This trap springs shut the moment operations against Iran begin. Now the political trap Australia's walking into. We're a US treaty ally, ANZUS obligations. If America acts, Australia supports. That's been doctrine since 1951. Prime Minister Albanese will face immediate pressure for public support. But here's the contradiction. Our largest trading partner is China, $219 billion in two-way trade annually. China has already signalled they'll support Iran diplomatically. State media editorials over the past week, subtle but clear. If Australia publicly supports US military action against Iran, China interprets that as choosing sides. And China has options. Slow coal shipments through customs inspections, delay iron ore payments through banking reviews. They've done both before. In 2020, when Australia called for COVID-19 investigation, China imposed import restrictions on barley, wine, beef and timber. $20 billion in export value affected within 6 months. That was over diplomatic statement. This would be over participation in military action against China's strategic partner. Australia faces an impossible choice: support the US and risk Chinese economic retaliation, or stay neutral and damage the alliance relationship. There's no middle path. Whatever choice Canberra makes will have consequences for your job, your investments, your cost of living. Construction sector, 1.2 million Australians, depends on Chinese steel and stable materials costs. Energy shocks break that. Resources sector, 280,000 Australians directly, depends on Chinese demand. Geopolitical tension breaks that. Retail, 1.4 million Australians, depends on consumer confidence and stable fuel costs. oil shocks break that. This is 2.9 million Australian jobs directly exposed to what happens in the next 2 weeks. This is 2.9 million Australian jobs directly exposed to what happens in the next 2 weeks. Let me make this concrete. What this means for Australian households. Your superannuation, average Australian super fund, holds 22 to 28% in Australian equities. BHP, Rio Tinto, Fortescue, top 10 holdings in most balanced funds. If commodity prices fall 15 to 20%, your super balance drops 3 to 5% within weeks. That's $2,500 to $4,500 for someone with an $85,000 balance. Your fuel costs. If petrol hits $2.50 per litre for 6 months, conservative during prolonged Hormuz crisis, a household driving 15,000 kilometres annually sees costs increase by $1,100. That's $92 per month. Your grocery bill, food transportation costs are 8 to 12% of retail food prices. When fuel costs rise 35 to 40%, grocery prices follow with 6 to 8 week lag. Average household spends $340 per week on groceries. A 6% increase is $21 per week, $1,092 annually. Your mortgage. If the RBA chooses inflation control over growth support, that likely means one more rate increase, 25 basis points. On a $600,000 mortgage, that's an additional $87 per month, $1,044 annually. Add those up, super loss, fuel increase, grocery increase, mortgage increase, you're looking at $5,500 to $7,500 in financial impact for a middle-income household within 6 months. That's not fear-mongering, that's arithmetic. And here's what makes this different. We don't have buffering capacity. Australian household savings rates are at 1.6%, lowest since 2008. Household debt-to-income ratios at 186%, the highest in Australian history. There's no cushion. When costs rise, households cut spending immediately. Retail suffers, employment follows. The economy isn't positioned for external shocks. It's fragile, and Trump's decision on Iran could be the shock that breaks it. What should you actually watch in coming days? Watch Pine Gap activity reports. If ABC or AFR report increased operational tempo, that's a 24 to 48 hour warning, means targeting data is actively processed. Watch oil futures curve. If Brent crude breaks above $90 per barrel on sustained volume, the market is pricing strike probability above 70%, currently $84. Breakpoint is $90. Watch RBA Governor Michelle Bullock's language. If she uses phrases like external supply shocks or energy market volatility, she's preparing public for policy constraints. Watch Chinese state media, Global Times and People's Daily English editions. If they publish op-eds about American aggression or defending strategic partners, China is signalling economic action. Watch Australian equity markets at open. Resources stocks, BHP, Rio, Fortescue, are your canary. If they're down 2% plus at 10 a.m. Sydney time on no company news, that's geopolitical risk pricing. Watch currency markets. Australian dollar historically weakens during commodity uncertainty. If Australian dollar to US dollar breaks below 0.62, that's risk-off positioning. Also makes imports more expensive, adding inflationary pressure. These aren't speculation points. These are concrete, measurable indicators showing how the situation evolves in real time. This isn't a prediction. I'm not telling you Trump will strike Iran. I'm not telling you the Strait will close. I'm not telling you commodity prices will collapse. What I'm telling you, the structural vulnerabilities exist. The Australian economy is exposed in ways most people don't recognise. Decisions being made in Washington right now create direct consequences for your financial security within weeks. The structure of global energy markets, the structure of Australian export dependencies, the structure of our refining capacity, these things don't care about politics. They respond to supply, demand, and physical reality. Understanding structure doesn't make you pessimistic, it makes you prepared. The Reserve Bank understands this. That's why they held an emergency meeting. Treasury understands this. That's why they are running stress models. Defence understands this. That's why they are coordinating with Pine Gap. The only people who don't understand are the general public because nobody's explaining it in these terms. That's what this analysis is for, not to create panic, to create understanding, because informed people make better decisions. The next 2 to 3 weeks will tell us whether this escalates or de-escalates, but the structure, the vulnerability, that's permanent. Australia's economic model is beautiful when global trade flows freely and commodity demand is strong, but it's fragile when energy markets destabilise and geopolitical tensions rise. We're about to find out how fragile. Stay informed, stay analytical, and remember, understanding markets isn't about reacting to headlines, it's about recognising the structure beneath.